For 730 days, a lion returned to the same rock at the same time every morning. He didn't hunt. He didn't follow a pride. He didn't move on. Every time a vehicle appeared on the road, he stood up, tense and alert, as if waiting for something only he remembered. But the vehicle always passed, and the lion slowly lay back down, continuing his silent vigil. No one knew who he was waiting for, until the truth finally surfaced, and those who witnessed it were left speechless. At the far edge of the reserve, where the savannah thinned into hard-packed earth and a single dirt road cut a pale line through the grass, a lone lion appeared every morning just before sunrise. The air at that hour was cool and still, carrying the faint smell of dust and dry leaves. From a low rock overlooking the road, the lion would sit and watch, his massive frame outlined against the slow light of dawn. Rangers who passed that way began to recognize him, not by a tag or a name, but by his habit. No matter the season, no matter the weather, he was always there. He was a full-grown male, broad-chested and powerfully built, with a mane that had once marked him as a dominant force on these plains. Yet something about him was wrong. Lions were not meant to be alone like this. A male without a pride was a temporary thing, a phase that ended either in victory or death. This lion chose neither. He did not roam in search of territory. He did not challenge rivals. He did not follow migrating herds the way hunger demanded. Instead, he waited. As the sun crested the horizon, the road began to wake. A supply truck would pass first, its tires humming softly over the dirt. Later came safari vehicles, carrying visitors eager to witness the raw beauty of African wildlife. Each time an engine sounded in the distance, the lion reacted in the same way. He rose to his feet with a sudden energy that seemed to come from nowhere. His head lifted, his body stiffened, and his amber eyes fixed on the approaching shape. For a moment, sometimes only a breath, he looked almost hopeful. Then the vehicle would pass without stopping. When it did, the change in him was immediate and unmistakable. His shoulders sagged, his tail stilled. He turned back to the rock and lowered himself with slow, deliberate movements, as if the weight he carried was not only physical. To those who watched from afar, it was unsettling. Predators were creatures of action and instinct, driven by survival and dominance. This lion seemed driven by something else entirely. The rangers began marking the days almost without realizing it. At first, they assumed the behavior would fade. Many animals displayed strange patterns after trauma or displacement, especially those that had crossed paths with humans during rescue operations or anti-poaching interventions. The reserve had seen its share of such cases. Wildlife conservation was rarely simple. Every animal carried a history written in scars and habits. But weeks turned into months, and the lion did not move on. He grew thinner. The muscle along his flanks tightened, then slowly wasted. His mane lost some of its fullness, dulled by dust and neglect. Yet still, every morning, he returned to the same rock at the same hour, as if answering a silent appointment no one else remembered. Some of the younger rangers joked uneasily, calling him the Waiting King. The older ones did not laugh. They had learned, through years of animal rescue and hard-earned experience, that when a wild creature broke its own rules, there was always a reason. From a distance, the lion watched the road the way others watched waterholes or herds. Intently, patiently. He did not pace. He did not roar. He simply waited, his gaze following the empty stretch long after the last vehicle disappeared. To anyone who believed animals lived only in the present, the scene made no sense. But those who had spent their lives in wildlife protection knew better. Memory was not a human monopoly. Some animals carried it deeply, sometimes at a terrible cost. By the end of the first year, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. The lion had abandoned any attempt to join nearby prides. When rival males approached, he retreated rather than fought. It was as if the world beyond the road had lost its meaning. His entire existence had narrowed to that strip of earth and the promise it seemed to hold. Conservation reports began to note his declining condition. Discussions followed, quiet ones, cautious ones, about intervention, relocation, even sedation for closer examination. Each option came with risks, legal considerations, and the ever-present tension between human responsibility and wild autonomy. Still, no one acted. Not yet. There was something about the way the lion watched that unsettled even the most seasoned professionals. It was not confusion. It was not fear. It was expectation. And expectation, when unfulfilled, could be as dangerous as hunger. As days accumulated into an unspoken count, hundreds of mornings, hundreds of sunsets, the lion remained faithful to his vigil. He did not know how many days had passed. He only knew that he was still waiting. What no one understood, standing on the other side of the fence with clipboards and radios, was that this was not the beginning of the story. It was the middle. The lion's patience was not born on that rock. It had been taught to him long before, in a moment of pain and mercy that had bound his fate to someone he could not see, but had never stopped remembering. By the second year of his vigil, it had become clear that the lion was no longer part of the natural order that governed the rest of the plains. Male lions survived by movement, by claiming, losing, and reclaiming territory in a cycle as old as the grass itself. This lion did none of that. He did not mark boundaries or patrol borders. He lived in the margins, tolerated only because he posed no challenge to anyone else. Other prides passed through the area with cautious indifference. A dominant male would approach, mane flared, muscles coiled for confrontation. The waiting lion would rise, assess him, and then step back. There was no submission in his posture, but no aggression either. He simply yielded the space and returned hours later to the same rock by the road. To the prides, he was an anomaly, neither threat nor ally, a king who had surrendered his crown without a fight. From a distance, his decline was subtle. Up close, it was alarming. His ribs had begun to show beneath his tawny coat, and old wounds reopened more easily than they should have. Flies lingered around his shoulders where the skin had grown thin. The strength was still there. Anyone who watched him move could see it, but it was locked behind restraint, as though he were conserving energy for something that had yet to arrive. The rangers debated his fate in low voices during evening briefings. Wildlife conservation demanded hard choices, and every decision carried legal and ethical weight. Some argued for relocation deeper into the reserve, away from the road and the constant disturbance of vehicles. Others suggested closer monitoring through satellite tracking and advanced animal behavior research. A few worried aloud about liability. An emaciated lion near a road was a risk, and risk always brought questions about responsibility, insurance coverage, and accountability. Only one voice consistently urged caution. Her name was Margaret Hale, though most people called her Maggie. She had been a ranger for more than 3 decades, long enough to watch policies change and change again. She had seen the evolution of wildlife protection from reactive animal rescue to carefully planned environmental protection strategies funded by government grants and nonprofit donations. Maggie understood the science, but she trusted her instincts just as much. "This isn't confusion," she said one night, tapping a photo of the lion taken from a drone. "And it's not dominance trauma. Look at his eyes. He's not lost. He's waiting. Waiting for what was the question no one could answer." Maggie began rising earlier than the others, parking her truck at a distance and watching the lion through binoculars as dawn unfolded. She noticed details others had missed: the way he always faced the same direction, the way his ears angled forward at the faintest sound of an engine, the way his posture changed, not into aggression, but anticipation when certain vehicles approached. Older trucks, with the smell of fuel and dust, seemed to hold his attention longer than sleek safari jeeps. As the days passed, Maggie felt an unease she could not put into a report. Wildlife management favored data and clear outcomes. This situation offered neither. The lion's condition was worsening, and yet every time intervention was discussed, something held her back. She had spent a lifetime learning that animals communicated in patterns, not words. Break the pattern too soon, and you might destroy the only clue you had. The reserve director pressed for answers. Visitors had begun asking questions. Online forums buzzed with speculation, and the lion's image, sitting alone on his rock, started circulating with captions about endurance and mystery. Increased attention meant increased scrutiny. Grants for wildlife conservation came with expectations, and expectations came with deadlines. Maggie stood her ground. "If we move him now," she warned, "we may never understand what he's doing, and if we don't understand it, we can't help him." Still, time was not on their side. The lion's isolation had become complete. Even the scavengers kept their distance, as if sensing a gravity around him that did not belong to hunger or fear. Each morning he returned to the road, and each night he slept nearby, close enough that the sound of passing tires could reach him in the dark. To Maggie, it felt like watching a clock count down without knowing what would happen when it reached zero. The lion was not dying quickly. He was fading inch by inch, held upright by a purpose no one could see. And somewhere beyond the reserve, unknown to both of them, the answer to his waiting remained just out of reach. By the time the dry season tightened its grip on the land, the lion's routine had become as fixed as the sun's path across the sky. Before the heat settled in and the cicadas began their relentless song, he climbed onto the rock overlooking the road and waited. The dust there was packed smooth by his weight, a shallow impression shaped by months of stillness. From that vantage point, he could see far enough to catch the first hint of movement long before engines were audible to human ears. When a vehicle appeared at the far bend, the change in him was immediate. His spine straightened. The muscles along his shoulders gathered beneath his skin, and his tail lifted just slightly, suspended between readiness and restraint. Maggie had watched enough lions hunt to recognize the difference. This was not predatory focus. There was no calculation of distance, no assessment of speed. It was attention of a different kind, directed, expectant, and strangely vulnerable. The sound grew louder. Tires pressed into gravel. Wind carried the scent of oil, metal, and warm dust. The lion lifted his head and opened his mouth, tasting the air. His eyes locked onto the vehicle as it drew closer, and for a brief moment Maggie could almost believe he recognized something in it. Then the truck passed. It did not slow. It did not stop. It disappeared into the shimmering distance, leaving only a faint trail of dust and an echo that faded too quickly. The lion remained standing for several seconds after it was gone. His ears stayed forward, as if listening for a sound that might return. When it didn't, his body seemed to fold inward. He lowered himself back onto the rock, movements careful and heavy, and stared at the empty road with an expression Maggie struggled to name. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was the quiet aftermath of disappointment. This cycle repeated itself again and again throughout the day. Supply vehicles heading to nearby lodges, maintenance trucks carrying water and fuel, occasionally a private car from the local communities beyond the reserve boundary, each time the same reaction, each time the same ending. The pattern was so precise it began to unsettle the staff. Lions were creatures of opportunity. They adapted quickly. But this lion seemed trapped in a loop that no amount of time could break. As weeks passed, Maggie started keeping informal notes, scribbling observations during her breaks. She logged the times, the types of vehicles, the lion's posture and recovery. Certain details stood out. He reacted more strongly to older trucks than to new safari vehicles. The smell of smoke or livestock lingering in the air held his attention longer than perfume and sunscreen. It was not random. It was selective. The rest of the team noticed it too. Conversations shifted from speculation to concern. The lion's weight continued to drop. His movements grew slower, and on some mornings he took longer to rise when the first engine sounded. A veterinarian suggested a closer examination, citing animal health and safety protocols. Discussions turned to liability and risk management, to insurance considerations and the responsibility of the reserve should the lion wander too close to the road. These were not abstract worries. Wildlife protection operated under layers of regulation, and every decision had consequences that reached far beyond the savannah. Maggie listened, but she hesitated. Intervening now felt like tearing a book from someone's hands before they reached the final chapter. She argued that understanding behavior was a form of care, just as important as medical treatment or physical rescue. This was not negligence, she insisted. It was patience. Still, the sight of the lion settling back onto his rock after yet another passing vehicle began to weigh on her. There was a cruelty in watching hope rise and fall so many times in a single day. Maggie found herself wondering what it cost an animal to hope like this, and how long such hope could be sustained without breaking something essential inside. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the road, Maggie noticed something new. A battered pickup truck approached, slower than most, its engine uneven. The lion reacted more intensely than she had ever seen. He stepped closer to the edge of the rock, chest lifted, eyes bright. His breathing quickened, and a low sound escaped his throat. Not a roar, but a rumble that vibrated through his body. The truck passed. The sound cut off abruptly, as if the breath had been knocked from him. The lion stood frozen, then turned away with a heaviness that made Maggie's chest ache. She lowered her binoculars and exhaled slowly. Whatever the lion was waiting for, it was not a place. It was not a territory. It was not even freedom. It was something, someone connected to the road, to the vehicles, to a memory that refused to fade. That night Maggie lay awake longer than usual, replaying the image of the lion's raised head and the way his posture had collapsed when the truck disappeared. Wildlife conservation often focused on numbers, on populations and habitats, on funding streams and long-term environmental protection strategies. But this felt personal. This felt like an individual life suspended between past and present, sustained by a promise only one side remembered. By the time dawn returned and the lion climbed back onto his rock, Maggie had reached a quiet conclusion. This was no longer just a mystery of animal behavior. It was a story of recognition and loss, unfolding in slow motion before their eyes. And if they did not find the truth behind it soon, there might not be enough time left to make it right. The decision to look closer came quietly, without an announcement or a vote. Maggie had learned long ago that some truths resisted committees. They revealed themselves only when one person paid attention long enough to notice what everyone else had learned to overlook. On a morning when the air hung heavy and still, she brought a long-range lens and watched the lion as he shifted on his rock, the light sliding across his chest at just the right angle. That was when she saw it. The scar was old, pale against the darker fur, running in a shallow arc just below the lion's left shoulder. It wasn't the jagged tear left by another male's claws, nor the puckered puncture of a horn or tusk. This was something else, too clean, too deliberate. Maggie felt a tightening in her stomach as recognition settled in. She had seen scars like that before, on animals that had crossed paths with people who did not wish them well. Wire. Later that day, she pulled the reserve's archived records, the ones that rarely saw daylight unless there was a legal dispute or an audit tied to wildlife conservation funding. The files were thin, frustratingly so. A brief incident report from several years back, coordinates near the reserve boundary, an entry noting illegal snare removed and animal stabilized. No photographs, no follow-up notes. Just enough information to close a case and move on. The implications unsettled her. A lion caught in a wire snare did not free itself. Someone had to cut it loose. Someone had to get close enough to risk teeth and claws, close enough to be remembered. Maggie knew what usually followed such encounters: fear, aggression, a lifetime wariness of humans that no rehabilitation program could fully erase. Yet the lion she watched now showed none of that. When a vehicle approached, he did not retreat. He leaned forward. Maggie requested permission for a remote health assessment under standard animal welfare guidelines, citing concerns about long-term injury and potential liability should the lion's condition deteriorate further. The paperwork moved slowly, as it always did, passing through layers of approval shaped by policy, insurance considerations, and the ever-present question of risk. In wildlife management, caution was not just prudence, it was protection against lawsuits, funding cuts, and public backlash. By the time clearance came through, the lion was already on his rock, waiting. From a safe distance, the veterinary team observed him through high-powered optics. They confirmed what Maggie had suspected. The scar was consistent with wire trauma, likely from a poacher's snare set for antelope or warthog. The surrounding tissue showed signs of old inflammation, evidence that the injury had once been severe. But what puzzled the veterinarian most was the absence of secondary defensive wounds. "He didn't fight," the vet said quietly. "At least, not the way most lions do." That single observation changed everything. An animal that fought a snare tore itself apart trying to escape, broken teeth, ripped gums, deep gashes from thrashing against metal. This lion bore none of those marks. It was as if, at some point, he had stopped struggling and allowed something, or someone, to come close. Maggie felt the shape of a story forming, one that didn't fit neatly into incident reports or training manuals. She watched the lion again as a truck passed along the road. His reaction was immediate, almost eager, followed by the familiar collapse when the vehicle continued on. The pattern no longer felt mysterious. It felt precise. The lion was not reacting to engines or movement alone. He was reacting to memory. That night, Maggie sat alone in her small office, the hum of an old fan stirring warm air. She thought about the unspoken costs of wildlife rescue, the human decisions made in moments of crisis, the unintended consequences that followed. People like to believe that saving an animal ended when the wound healed. But some injuries lived deeper, beyond skin and bone, carried quietly for years. She imagined the moment the snare had been cut away. The pain, the shock, the strange stillness that followed when danger did not arrive as expected. Whoever had freed the lion had done more than remove wire. They had altered the animal's understanding of the world. Trust, once given, did not easily disappear. It waited stubbornly for proof that it had not been misplaced. The next morning, Maggie arrived before dawn. The lion was already there, his silhouette steady against the paling sky. She felt a mix of resolve and unease settle over her. This discovery carried weight. It raised questions about responsibility and ethics, about how far the reserve could go without violating its own rules. It touched on broader issues of wildlife protection, community involvement, and the thin line between necessary intervention and harmful attachment. If the lion had been helped once by someone outside the system, what had happened to that person? Had they been warned away, fined, threatened with legal action? Had they been told, as so many were, that stepping aside was the right thing to do? Maggie knew the language well. She had used it herself, backed by policy and the reassurance that professional care was always best. Now she wasn't so sure. The scar on the lion's chest was more than evidence of cruelty. It was proof of connection. And if Maggie was right, the road the lion watched so faithfully was not just a boundary between the wild and the human world. It was a thread, stretched thin by time, tying him to someone who had once stood where the vehicles now passed, believing, perhaps incorrectly, that letting go was an act of mercy. The trail Maggie followed did not lead deeper into the reserve. It led outward toward the places where rules blurred and survival made its own demands. She began with the coordinates in the old incident report, tracing them on a faded map spread across her desk. The location sat near the boundary where protected land met scattered homesteads, an area shaped as much by human hardship as by wildlife movement. It was the kind of place where poachers set snares not out of malice alone, but desperation, where a single antelope could mean school fees, medical bills, or the difference between hunger and one more month of stability. Maggie drove there late one afternoon, the heat wavering above the dirt road. She passed rusted fencing, abandoned water drums, and patches of ground where grass refused to grow back after years of overuse. It was quiet in a way that felt permanent. The people who lived here knew the land intimately, not as a sanctuary, but as a source of daily risk and reward. If someone had cut a lion free in this place, it would not have been a trained ranger or a funded rescue team. It would have been a man acting alone. She asked questions carefully. Not everyone welcomed them. Wildlife authorities were not always seen as allies, especially in communities where conservation rules could feel like another form of loss. But Maggie had learned patience. She listened more than she spoke. Gradually, a name surfaced, spoken softly, almost reluctantly. Daniel Cato. He lived a few miles from the boundary, in a small house built from salvaged wood and tin. Maggie found him sitting on a low stool outside, repairing a torn fishing net. He was older than she expected, his hair streaked with gray, his movements deliberate and slow. When she introduced herself, he did not look surprised. He looked tired. They spoke for a long time before the lion was mentioned. Daniel talked about drought, about how unpredictable work had become, about the rising cost of fuel and food. He spoke of his son, lost years earlier in an accident that had left a silence in his home no sound ever quite filled. Maggie listened, understanding now why some men walked so close to the edges of legality. Survival had its own logic. When she finally asked about the lion, Daniel's hand stilled. He did not deny it. "I wasn't supposed to do it," he said quietly. "I knew that." The memory came back to him in fragments. A young lion, barely grown, caught in a wire snare meant for smaller prey. The animal had been exhausted, dehydrated, too weak to fight. Daniel had expected rage, had braced himself for teeth and claws. Instead, the lion had watched him with wide, unblinking eyes. When Daniel cut the wire, the lion did not flee. It stayed close, breathing hard, trembling with pain and shock. For days afterward, Daniel had returned, bringing water, leaving scraps of meat at a careful distance. He had slept poorly, listening for sounds of distress in the night. Against his better judgment, he had stayed longer than he should have, talking to the lion as if it could understand. He told Maggie that the animal followed him once, limping, refusing to be left behind. It was then that Daniel began leading the lion to the rock by the road, a place with fewer hyenas and a clear view of approaching danger. "I thought if he saw people, cars, noise, he'd learn to keep away," Daniel said. "I thought distance would teach him safety." The day the rangers arrived, Daniel knew it was over. He watched from a distance as the lion was tranquilized and loaded into a vehicle. He remembered the sound the animal made, not a roar, but something lower, roar. He had wanted to step forward, to explain, to stay. But fear held him back. He had already broken the law once. He believed, as he had been told many times before, that professionals would do better than he ever could. When Maggie told him about the lion on the rock, about the waiting and the slow decline, Daniel's shoulders sagged. He stared at the ground for a long time, as if counting the years between then and now. He had assumed the lion had forgotten him, or died. He had told himself that letting go was the price of doing the right thing. Hearing otherwise reopened something he had carefully buried. "I never meant for him to wait," Daniel said. "I just wanted him to live." Maggie felt the weight of that truth settle between them. In wildlife conservation, intentions were often judged by outcomes, not by the choices made in moments of fear and compassion. Daniel had saved the lion's life and, without knowing it, reshaped it. The bond formed in those days of quiet care had not faded with distance. It had hardened into something enduring. As she drove back toward the reserve, Maggie considered the implications. Bringing Daniel back into the lion's life would challenge established protocols and raise questions about liability, ethics, and the long-term goals of animal rehabilitation. Yet doing nothing meant allowing a slow, invisible suffering to continue. In recent years, conservation programs had begun to acknowledge the psychological dimensions of animal welfare, supported by growing research and increased funding for behavioral studies. Still, cases like this existed in the margins, where policy lagged behind reality. When Maggie reached the familiar stretch of road and saw the lion on his rock, she felt a certainty she had not known before. The lion was not waiting for the wild to make sense again. He was waiting for a man who believed he had already let go. The days that followed Maggie's meeting with Daniel unfolded with a new weight, as though time itself had thickened. Every morning the lion climbed onto his rock, just as he always had, unaware that the man he waited for was alive, breathing, and thinking of him for the first time in years. And every morning Daniel woke before the sun, staring at the ceiling of his small house, replaying memories he had long convinced himself were finished. On the surface, nothing changed. The lion still watched the road. Vehicles still passed. Hope still rose and fell with the sound of engines. But Maggie saw the vigil differently now. What once looked like stubborn behavior had become heartbreakingly clear. The lion was not trapped by instinct. He was loyal to a promise formed in pain and relief, in the moment wire had been cut and suffering had stopped. For 2 years, that promise had been all he had left. His condition continued to decline. His ribs showed more clearly with each passing week, and his movements grew cautious, as if conserving energy had become second nature. The veterinary team monitored him from a distance, documenting weight loss and signs of chronic stress. Reports referenced animal welfare standards and risk assessments, the language careful and precise. Discussions of intervention always circled back to the same concerns: legal liability, safety protocols, insurance coverage, should something go wrong. These were not empty worries. One wrong decision could jeopardize funding, expose the reserve to lawsuits, and threaten jobs built on years of careful environmental protection planning. Yet none of that language captured what Maggie saw when she looked at the lion's eyes. They were not dull. They were focused. There was an intelligence there that had not faded, only narrowed. His world had contracted to a single point, and everything outside it had lost meaning. Maggie understood, with a clarity that startled her, that if nothing changed, the lion would not die suddenly. He would simply diminish, slowly and quietly, until there was nothing left to wait with. Daniel's days followed a different rhythm, but the weight was the same. He had returned to the boundary of the reserve once, standing far enough back that no one noticed him. He did not see the lion from where he stood, but he imagined him there, still watching. The thought hollowed him out. He had believed he was doing the right thing all those years ago. He had believed that distance was a form of protection, that professionals and policies would give the lion a better future than he ever could. Now that belief felt fragile. Daniel knew the consequences of returning. He knew the rules, the fines, the potential charges. Wildlife laws were strict for a reason, and he respected them. But the older he grew, the more he understood that some costs were paid regardless of legality. Losing his son had taught him that silence could be as destructive as any mistake. The lion had given him something during those weeks of care, a sense of purpose he had not realized he was missing. Walking away had not erased that bond. It had only buried it. Maggie struggled with her own conflict. Her career had been built on balancing compassion with discipline, on understanding that good intentions did not excuse reckless action. She had seen well-meaning people cause harm by overstepping boundaries, by treating wild animals as extensions of their own emotional needs. This was different. The lion had not been imprinted on Daniel like a pet. He had been stabilized, guided, then released. The bond that remained was not dependency. It was memory. The data supported what her instincts told her. Recent studies in animal behavior research, many funded through expensive grant programs and private conservation insurance initiatives, had begun to recognize the role of psychological trauma in wildlife health. Stress-related illness could weaken immune systems, slow healing, and shorten lifespans. In humans, the cost of untreated emotional trauma was well documented, reflected in rising healthcare costs and long-term disability claims. Maggie saw no reason the principle would not apply here. Still, acting on that knowledge meant stepping into uncertain territory. She spent evenings reviewing policies, looking for precedents, for language that allowed flexibility. She found very little. Most guidelines assumed clean breaks between rescue and release. Ongoing contact was considered a risk factor, something to be avoided to ensure successful reintegration. No one had planned for a lion who refused to move on. One afternoon, the lion failed to rise when the first truck approached. He lifted his head, ears twitching, but remained on the rock. The moment passed, and he lay still, breathing slow and shallow. Maggie felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. This was not patience anymore. This was exhaustion. That night, she drove to Daniel's house without calling ahead. He met her at the door, his expression guarded, as if he already knew why she was there. They spoke briefly, the air heavy with what remained unsaid. Maggie explained the lion's condition, the risks, the limits of what the reserve could officially sanction. She explained the potential consequences, the scrutiny, the possibility that her decision could end her career. Daniel listened, then nodded once. "If seeing me hurts him," he said, "I'll live with that. But if not seeing me is killing him, then I already waited too long." Maggie drove back to the reserve with a sense of inevitability. The lion would return to his rock in the morning. The road would fill with dust and sound. And somewhere between protocol and compassion, a decision would have to be made, one that could save a life or cost more than anyone was prepared to lose. The days that followed Maggie's meeting with Daniel unfolded with a new weight, as though time itself had thickened. Every morning the lion climbed onto his rock, just as he always had, unaware that the man he waited for was alive, breathing, and thinking of him for the first time in years. And every morning Daniel woke before the sun, staring at the ceiling of his small house, replaying memories he had long convinced himself were finished. On the surface, nothing changed. The lion still watched the road. Vehicles still passed. Hope still rose and fell with the sound of engines. But Maggie saw the vigil differently now. What once looked like stubborn behavior had become heartbreakingly clear. The lion was not trapped by instinct. He was loyal to a promise formed in pain and relief, in the moment wire had been cut and suffering had stopped. For 2 years, that promise had been all he had left. His condition continued to decline. His ribs showed more clearly with each passing week, and his movements grew cautious, as if conserving energy had become second nature. The veterinary team monitored him from a distance, documenting weight loss and signs of chronic stress. Reports referenced animal welfare standards and risk assessments, the language careful and precise. Discussions of intervention always circled back to the same concerns: legal liability, safety protocols, insurance coverage, should something go wrong. These were not empty worries. One wrong decision could jeopardize funding, expose the reserve to lawsuits, and threaten jobs built on years of careful environmental protection planning. Yet none of that language captured what Maggie saw when she looked at the lion's eyes. They were not dull. They were focused. There was an intelligence there that had not faded, only narrowed. His world had contracted to a single point, and everything outside it had lost meaning. Maggie understood, with a clarity that startled her, that if nothing changed, the lion would not die suddenly. He would simply diminish, slowly and quietly, until there was nothing left to wait with. Daniel's days followed a different rhythm, but the wait was the same. He had returned to the boundary of the reserve once, standing far enough back that no one noticed him. He did not see the lion from where he stood, but he imagined him there, still watching. The thought hollowed him out. He had believed he was doing the right thing all those years ago. He had believed that distance was a form of protection, that professionals and policies would give the lion a better future than he ever could. Now that belief felt fragile. Daniel knew the consequences of returning. He knew the rules, the fines, the potential charges. Wildlife laws were strict for a reason, and he respected them. But the older he grew, the more he understood that some costs were paid regardless of legality. Losing his son had taught him that silence could be as destructive as any mistake. The lion had given him something during those weeks of care, a sense of purpose he had not realized he was missing. Walking away had not erased that bond. It had only buried it. Maggie struggled with her own conflict. Her career had been built on balancing compassion with discipline, on understanding that good intentions did not excuse reckless action. She had seen well-meaning people cause harm by overstepping boundaries, by treating wild animals as extensions of their own emotional needs. This was different. The lion had not been imprinted on Daniel like a pet. He had been stabilized, guided, then released. The bond that remained was not dependency. It was memory. The data supported what her instincts told her. Recent studies in animal behavior research, many funded through expensive grant programs and private conservation insurance initiatives, had begun to recognize the role of psychological trauma in wildlife health. Stress-related illness could weaken immune systems, slow healing, and shorten lifespans. In humans, the cost of untreated emotional trauma was well documented, reflected in rising healthcare costs and long-term disability claims. Maggie saw no reason the principle would not apply here. Still, acting on that knowledge meant stepping into uncertain territory. She spent evenings reviewing policies, looking for precedents, for language that allowed flexibility. She found very little. Most guidelines assumed clean breaks between rescue and release. Ongoing contact was considered a risk factor, something to be avoided to ensure successful reintegration. No one had planned for a lion who refused to move on. One afternoon, the lion failed to rise when the first truck approached. He lifted his head, ears twitching, but remained on the rock. The moment passed, and he lay still, breathing slow and shallow. Maggie felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. This was not patience anymore. This was exhaustion. That night, she drove to Daniel's house without calling ahead. He met her at the door, his expression guarded, as if he already knew why she was there. They spoke briefly, the air heavy with what remained unsaid. Maggie explained the lion's condition, the risks, the limits of what the reserve could officially sanction. She explained the potential consequences, the scrutiny, the possibility that her decision could end her career. Daniel listened, then nodded once. "If seeing me hurts him," he said, "I'll live with that. But if not seeing me is killing him, then I already waited too long." Maggie drove back to the reserve with a sense of inevitability. The lion would return to his rock in the morning. The road would fill with dust and sound. And somewhere between protocol and compassion, a decision would have to be made, one that could save a life or cost more than anyone was prepared to lose. The morning Maggie made her decision, the sky was heavy with low clouds, pressing down on the plains as if the land itself were holding its breath. She stood beside her truck longer than usual, watching the lion from a distance. He was already on the rock, his silhouette thinner than it had been months ago, his posture less certain. When a vehicle passed and he failed to stand, Maggie felt something inside her settle into resolve. There was no emergency meeting, no formal approval. She understood exactly what that meant. In wildlife conservation, especially in a reserve that depended on government oversight, international donors, and carefully structured environmental protection funding, decisions were expected to be clean and defensible. They were meant to fit into reports, risk assessments, and liability frameworks that protected both animals and institutions. What Maggie was about to do fit into none of those categories. She documented everything anyway. Her notes were meticulous, written in the measured language of professional care. Declining body condition, prolonged stress indicators, failure of standard non-invasive interventions. She referenced emerging animal behavior research, studies that linked psychological trauma to immune suppression and long-term health decline. She framed the situation as a last resort welfare consideration, knowing full well that no policy explicitly allowed what she was proposing. Documentation, she had learned, was not always protection, but it was a form of honesty. When she called Daniel, her voice was steady. "One visit," she said. "You come in with me. You don't cross the barrier. You don't touch him unless he comes to you. If at any point this goes wrong, we stop." Daniel agreed without hesitation. He did not ask what would happen to Maggie if this failed, or what penalties he might face. Those questions felt small compared to the weight of 2 years of waiting. He packed nothing but a bottle of water and the worn jacket he had been wearing the day the lion was taken away. He had never washed it properly. He told himself it was habit. Maggie suspected it was hope. They drove slowly along the dirt road, the same road the lion watched every day. Maggie's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the familiar landscape passed by. Acacia trees, low brush, the faint tracks of antelope crossing and recrossing paths, worn smooth by time. She wondered how many times the lion had memorized this view, how many subtle changes he had catalogued while waiting for one thing that never came. As they approached the rock, Maggie felt her heart begin to pound. She forced herself to focus on procedure. Radios were checked. Backup vehicles were positioned at a distance. No tourists were allowed on that stretch of road. From the outside, it looked like routine management. Inside, Maggie knew she was gambling her career on a single moment. The lion noticed the vehicle long before Maggie slowed. His head lifted, his ears angled forward. For the first time in days, he rose to his feet. Maggie's breath caught. Daniel said nothing, his gaze fixed ahead, his hands resting on his knees. They stopped at the designated point, just beyond the barrier that separated road from reserve interior. Maggie stepped out first, her movements slow and deliberate. She raised one hand slightly, a signal to the team watching from afar. Everything depended on the next few seconds. The lion stood motionless, his eyes locked on the truck. His chest rose and fell faster now. He took one step forward, then another, until he reached the limit of the barrier. Maggie felt the tension ripple outward, a silent question hanging in the air. Recognition or confusion? Healing or harm? Daniel stepped down from the truck. Before he spoke, before he moved any closer, the lion reacted. It was not a roar in the way people imagined. No display of dominance or threat. It was a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest, a sound Maggie had never heard from him before. His body leaned forward, muscles trembling, and his eyes widened with an intensity that made Maggie's throat tighten. This was not fear. This was memory awakening. Daniel froze. He did not raise his hands. He did not speak the lion's name. He simply stood there, breathing, as if afraid that any sudden movement might break whatever fragile bridge was forming between them. The lion paced once along the barrier, then returned to the exact spot opposite Daniel. He lowered his head slightly, his posture no longer guarded, no longer resigned. Maggie felt tears blur her vision, though she barely registered them. Every instinct she had developed over 30 years told her she was witnessing something rare and irreversible. For 2 years, the lion had waited for proof that his trust had not been misplaced. And now, standing on the road, he had watched so faithfully. That proof had finally arrived. But Maggie also knew this was not the end. It was the most dangerous part. If this moment turned into dependency, if the lion refused to move on after Daniel left, the consequences would be devastating. For the animal, for the reserve, and for Maggie herself. Wildlife insurance policies and conservation funding did not account for bonds like this. They accounted for numbers, outcomes, and risk mitigation. And right now, the risk was immense. Maggie raised her radio and quietly instructed the team to stand down but stay alert. The lion's reaction was stronger than she had dared to hope. Too strong, perhaps. The next minutes would determine whether this decision would be remembered as a breakthrough in animal welfare or as a mistake that cost her everything she had built. Daniel took one cautious step closer to the barrier. The lion did not retreat. He leaned in. Maggie held her breath. The lion did not need to see Daniel's face to know. Before a word was spoken, before a hand was raised or a step taken, the lion drew in a long breath and froze. His head lifted higher than it had in months, nostrils flaring as the wind shifted across the road. Something moved through him then, swift and unmistakable. It showed in the sudden tightening of his muscles, in the way his tail lifted and stilled, in the sharp clarity that replaced the dull patience he had carried for so long. He had been waiting for a scent. A sound rose from deep within his chest, low and vibrating, carrying across the open ground like a message meant for only one listener. Maggie felt it in her bones. The lion stepped forward until the barrier stopped him, his body pressed close, eyes fixed not on the truck or the uniforms or the radios, but on Daniel alone. In that instant, the waiting ended. Daniel's breath caught. He had imagined this moment in 100 different ways, always fearing the same outcome, that the lion would look through him, indifferent or worse, react with confusion or fear. Instead, what he saw in those eyes was recognition so immediate it left no room for doubt. The lion leaned forward, mane brushing the wire, and let out another sound, softer now, almost questioning. "It's me," Daniel whispered, though he knew the words did not matter. The lion shifted his weight, pacing once along the barrier before returning to the same spot, the same distance, as if measuring something only he understood. Then slowly he lowered his head. The tension that had held his body rigid for 2 years drained away, replaced by a stillness that felt like relief. Maggie watched the change unfold with a mix of awe and fear. This was the moment she had hoped for, and the moment she had feared. For a long time, nothing else happened. Daniel did not reach out. He did not speak again. He stood there, allowing the lion to set the terms, just as he had years ago when wire cut into flesh and trust had been the only thing keeping them both alive. The lion's breathing steadied, his ears relaxed. The sound that escaped him now was a low rumble, steady and deep, carrying a resonance that seemed to settle the air itself. Minutes passed, the team, watching from a distance, barely moved. No one spoke into their radios. It felt wrong to intrude on something that was clearly not meant for an audience. Maggie's thoughts raced ahead to the consequences, to reports, inquiries, and difficult conversations about liability and professional risk. Yet none of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was that the lion was no longer alone in his memory. When Daniel finally stepped back, the lion did not follow. He remained at the barrier, watching, eyes calm. There was no panic, no frantic movement. The bond, it seemed, did not demand possession. It only required acknowledgement. The visit lasted less than an hour. Daniel returned to the truck, his movements heavy, but his face strangely light. As they drove away, Maggie glanced back through the mirror. The lion stood where he always had, but something about him was different. He was no longer rigid with expectation. He sat, then lay down, his head resting on his paws as he watched the road fade into distance. The next morning, Maggie arrived early, her stomach tight with apprehension. She scanned the familiar rock as dawn broke. It was empty. For a moment, panic flared. She searched the surrounding ground, her heart pounding. Then she saw him, farther in, moving across the plains with a steadiness she had not seen in him before. His gait was slow but purposeful, his head held higher, his body no longer folded inward on itself. He did not look back at the road. Over the weeks that followed, the change held. The lion began testing the boundaries of other prides, not with aggression, but with confidence. He fed more regularly. His weight stabilized, then slowly improved. The veterinary reports reflected what Maggie saw with her own eyes. Stress markers declining, immune response strengthening, behavior returning to baseline. The waiting rock became just another part of the landscape, no longer the center of his world. Daniel did not return again. He did not ask to. Knowing, it turned out, was enough. The reserve conducted its reviews quietly. Maggie's decision was questioned, debated, and eventually documented as an exceptional case, one that would influence future discussions about animal welfare, psychological trauma, and the limits of rigid protocol. In an industry increasingly shaped by data-driven outcomes, insurance requirements, and long-term conservation funding strategies, the case became a reminder that not all costs could be calculated in advance. Some nights, Maggie drove past the rock and slowed, half expecting to see the lion there again. She never did. The rock remained, weathered and silent, its purpose fulfilled. The lion had not been waiting for rescue. He had been waiting for proof that the trust he gave away in pain had not been forgotten. And when he finally received it, he was free to leave.